Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a really massive question. It impacts pretty much everyone, from tech developers right through to people in churches. It's this profound and often, let's be honest, challenging intersection of technology and belief. Our deep dive today is really set up to unpack the specific challenges that Christian faith faces, in this modern digital world we all live in. Yeah, our mission really is to look closely at the source material we've gathered and ask this pretty provocative question. Can faith actually survive in a digital world? We're going to examine how this constant connection, social media, that relentless stream of information overload, how it's fundamentally shaping or maybe even eroding spiritual discipline today. And the core tension here is, well, it's immediate. Our sources frame it perfectly, I think, with this simple but really powerful hook. It basically asks, we scroll for hours, but when was the last time we scrolled through scripture?
Wow. Yeah, that single question just captures the whole modern dilemma, doesn't it?
That pull of digital distraction versus the quiet, sometimes demanding nature of spiritual discipline. Let's try and unpack this tension right now. Okay, so our first big question, and it's highlighted right there in the sources, feels foundational for any modern believer. Does social media ultimately help or hurt our spiritual life? We kind of need to acknowledge both sides here. So maybe what are some arguments for the help side of this digital dichotomy before we really dive into the hurt?
Yeah, it's crucial to start with the positives, you're right, because these digital tools, they aren't inherently bad or evil. And what's fascinating, really, is how effectively technology can support community, especially for people who might be geographically spread out or perhaps feel marginalized in other ways. I mean, it gives you instant access to theological resources, countless Bible translations, global prayer networks, things that were, physically impossible even 50 years ago. So that potential for connection and learning, it's massive. However, and this is a big however, the challenge really tops up when we look at the structure of the platforms themselves. Often, the harm isn't actually the specific content you see. It's the medium. It's how it's delivered. The sheer volume of information, the speed of social media it's all designed for, like instant consumption and constant novelty. That acts as a really severe shaping force on us. And if faith requires things like patience, depth, maybe slowness, well, the digital world is often the exact opposite of that.
That distinction you just made between the content and the medium, that's a really powerful insight. We should probably slow down on that for a second. You mentioned the speed, the structure of these platforms. For someone listening, just trying to process all this input, what exactly are the immediate, maybe psychological implications of this constant connectivity, especially on their ability to, maintain focus or find quiet for contemplation?
Well, think about what the algorithm trains your brain to expect. Yeah. When you're constantly flicking between apps, checking notifications, you develop something psychologists actually call attention residue. You finish checking one app, say Instagram, but a piece of your focus, it kind of stays stuck back there, maybe on the unread messages or the last argument you glimpsed. And this is really detrimental to spiritual practice, which generally requires your whole attention, your undivided focus. So when your brain gets trained for these quick, instant dopamine hits from notifications or from really short-form content like TikToks or Reels, then the idea of sustained, quiet engagement, like, say, reading a dense 300-year-old theological text or even just engaging in 20 minutes of silent prayer, that suddenly feels monumentally exhausting. It feels hard. The platform architecture itself, things like the infinite scroll, the priority notifications popping up, it actively works against developing spiritual patience.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It feels like the systems themselves are almost literally built to keep us from stillness, from quiet. The spiritual part of us might be seeking rest or depth, and the phone is just buzzing, demanding a response right now. Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Connecting this technological structure back to that classic theological concept you mentioned, cited in our sources. Balancing this idea of being in the world but not of it. Mm-hmm. For centuries, that meant, participation without corruption, living among secular culture without just adopting all its values wholesale. But how on earth does that work when the world isn't just a neighborhood or a specific culture anymore, but it's this pervasive, always-on digital environment literally living in your pocket?
Mm-hmm. This raises a really important question about identity and influence, doesn't it? Historically, you could physically retreat, you could go to a monastery, sure, or you can simply close your front door, shut out the noise. But now the world, in this digital sense, has successfully infiltrated our physical private spaces, 247. So if being of the world means being molded by it, shaped by its values, then in the digital age, that translates maybe to being overwhelmed and defined by this endless stream of data, these instant opinions, and even the sort of performance required by curating an online identity. Maintaining that spiritual distinction, that separation, becomes incredibly difficult. Why? because the digital environment demands your presence. It demands your reaction, your identity constantly. The sources we looked at make it pretty clear that the boundary between, let's say, the sacred self and the digital echo chamber is constantly getting blurred. And often, let's face it, the echo chamber wins out just because of the sheer volume and the easy accessibility of all that input.
Right. So if the platforms are basically architected, designed to destroy stillness and encourage constant reaction, then trying to maintain a clear spiritual distinction, that not of it part, requires us to really understand how that architecture works against us. Could you maybe clarify a bit more what we mean when we talk about platform architecture working against faith practices?
Absolutely. And it's simpler than it might sound, really. Platform architecture just refers to the intentional design choices made by the tech companies to maximize user engagement. That's the goal. Why do you have infinite scroll in most social media feeds? Well, because stopping requires a conscious choice. It might lead to reflection. They don't want you to stop. Why do notifications light up your screen immediately, often with sound? Because your attention is the currency they're trading in. These features are deliberately designed to encourage shallow, fragmented consumption of information. Now contrast that with spiritual discipline. What does it ask of you? It often asks you to sit still, to engage in deep, maybe linear thought, and actively resist distraction. So the very moment you open that app, the architecture itself has already initiated a kind of psychological conflict. It's pulling you away from depth and towards that surface-level reactivity. The integrity of your faith practice is challenged precisely because these systems are designed to minimize your personal control over your own time and your own focus.
That insight feels relevant even if someone listening doesn't identify as religious, doesn't it? I mean, the struggle to maintain any kind of deep work or focused thought, or even just read a book against the constant flow of the internet, it feels like the same core fight. It's basically attention management for everyone in the 21st century. Okay, this brings us neatly to the practical application side of things. The critical so what? For you, the listener. The sources we reviewed explicitly pivot to actionable advice here, defining practical digital boundaries for believers. This is like the defense strategy against all these forces we've been discussing. So if constant connection and information overload are the enemies of contemplation, what tangible, specific steps can people actually take to manage that digital input? We need to get specific here, I think.
Exactly. This is where we shift from just diagnosing the problem to looking at the prescription, the solutions. And boundaries here aren't just, nice preferences or lifestyle tweaks. They're presented as a required response, a necessary defense to ensure that the shaping influence of the digital age doesn't completely displace core faith practices. The sources detail several intentional controls people can put in place. First, they strongly advocate for something called device fasting. Now, this isn't just putting your phone down for an hour while you watch TV. It's about designating specific periods, maybe the first hour of your day, or perhaps an entire day of the week, like a digital Sabbath, as completely device-free. Think about it. If you allow that digital stream to be the default setting the moment you wake up, it immediately dictates the pace and the mood of your entire day.
Right, so it's about actively creating an analog start to the day, maybe, to set a spiritual tone, rather than just letting the notification set the tone for you. Okay, what's another concrete example? Another intentional control.
Okay, another crucial step mentioned is designated device use. This basically means separating your devices based on their function. So if you primarily use your smartphone for social media browsing, news consumption, endless scrolling, maybe don't use that same device for reading scripture or for prayer journaling. The sources actually suggest utilizing separate devices if possible. Maybe a dedicated e-reader that only has books on it, or even just a physical book for your spiritual time. Why? Because the phone itself carries that psychological residue of distraction we talked about. Okay. So that directly addresses that internal conflict caused by attention residue. If my brain automatically associates this phone with distraction and dopamine hits, I need a different tool that's only associated with stillness or focused reading. Makes sense? Exactly. And a third practical step highlighted is implementing hard time boundaries. This means not just limiting how much time you spend online, which is important, but also when you spend it. The sources strongly suggest enforcing a complete digital curfew, absolutely no scrolling, maybe not even checking email after a certain hour, say 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. And this isn't just about getting better sleep, although that's a benefit. It's really about providing sacred, uninterrupted space for maybe evening reflection, quiet preparation for rest, preventing that digital chaos from spilling over into your most vulnerable, reflective periods of the day.
Yeah, and what feels really important here listening to this is that setting these boundaries isn't being framed as just, a lifestyle adjustment or a productivity hack. It's actually framed as a form of spiritual discipline in itself, a conscious recognition that your time and your attention are finite, precious resources that are constantly under siege by these engagement algorithms. So managing the digital input effectively becomes managing your spiritual health.
It really is. It's framed as a radical act of resistance in today's world. This kind of active limitation helps ensure that the sheer speed and volume of the digital world don't end up defining the pace and the depth of your faith journey. It allows you, the individual, to be intentional about what shapes your inner life, rather than just being passively shaped by that constant external flow. So just to quickly synthesize what we've covered, we've looked at three major tensions, really, inherent in the digital life of a believer today. First, that help or hurt dynamic of social media, recognizing its potential for community, absolutely, but also its systemic bias towards distraction and shallowness. Second, the real difficulty of balancing spiritual integrity with this pervasive digital presence, emphasizing that acute challenge of being in the world but not of it, when the world is constantly pinging you, demanding engagement. And finally, the absolute necessity, it seems, of establishing clear, practical digital boundaries, things like device fasting, designated use, time curfews as a crucial defense mechanism.
So, what does all this mean for you listening right now? Well, our deep dive today reveals that the challenge here is far more complex than just simple time management, isn't it? It really is a battle. A battle for attention, for focus, and ultimately for spiritual integrity in a world that often feels designed to fragment all three. Hopefully, you now feel better equipped with the core insights from our source material about how to actively manage that tension, how to maybe resist the digital tide a little more effectively. But let me leave you with a final thought to carry forward, something that builds on that initial survival question. If faith is continually being challenged and shaped by this constant digital connection, and if the very tools of distraction are often the main tools we use for community and information, then we have to ask maybe if the very meaning of spiritual life itself is evolving under the constant influence of the screen. What does a truly surviving faith even look like when your community, your devotion, your scriptures, and your biggest distractions all live inside that single handheld device? And maybe the only clear path forward involves this kind of radical boundary setting we've discussed. That's something for you to explore perhaps as you navigate your own digital stream.